Hello, friends. So, my next guest has been an environmental attorney in New York for over 40 years. As if that isn't fascinating enough, we're going to be discussing something else, something a bit closer to all of our hearts, certainly of a certain ilk, and that is the JFK assassination. Let's get into it. Larry, how are you, sir?
Okay. Good afternoon to you. Early morning for me.
Yes, we were saying, weren't we? It's liaising stateside can always throws up a few issues with the time differences. And you've got how many time zones in the states?
Three, if you, well, for the continental, it's three. And then if you include Hawaii and Alaska, I guess it's two more.
Yes, yes. Just to add to the confusion, um, it's funny. My local church has just decided right now they're going to do their bell ringing practice. so,
And
so
by the way, I think it's Indiana has two different time zones. So the for some reason Indiana decides they couldn't decide which one. So part of the state is in the Eastern time zone and part of the state is in the central time zone. So part of the state's an hour behind the other part of the state. I don't know how
wow.
they do that.
So if you wanted to lie in the morning, you could just drag your bed across the line, and your boss can't say anything to you.
Right? And if you want to leave early, it won't work.
So JFK, Larry, obvious question. I'm sure you're sick of being asked it, but what? How did this pique your interest?
Well, I was 10 when he was shot, and like everyone else in our generation, very vivid memory. But I have a funny story about even just hearing about it. Because first of all, Um, I was in fifth grade. We had just been discharged from class, from school, and I was in this full corridor of students. And one of my friends comes up to me, says, "The president's been shot." And the first image I had in my mind was of Lincoln. I only knew of Lincoln, being shot behind the head. So I had this image of like someone coming up from behind the president sitting in a chair and shooting him. So I ran up to the front of the school to talk to this girl who I liked to tell her the president's been shot. And she said, "Nah, that doesn't happen nowadays." So we get home, and so this is like it's an hour after he actually was shot. And one of my friends calls me, and now we're in New Jersey. So New Jersey is on the East Coast. I mean, New Jersey's like 3 hours by jet, 4 hours by plane, and this is 1963, so everyone uses airplanes, propellers. My friend calls me and tells me the assassin is in New Jersey and he's coming our way. So we're 10 years old. So we go grab our Boy Scout knives, we get some rope, and we go down to the creek behind our house to wait for him. So here's these three 10-year-olds with the Boy Scout knives and rope waiting for the assassin to come walk by so we can capture him and give him to the police.
Hey,
Um,
I tell you what, Larry. Weirder things happened on that day, didn't they?
yes, yes. But and then I'm playing touch football, American football, in the street when Oswald gets shot. And that was the first time I think that when people said, "Ooh, there's something weird about this." But I didn't really get involved until eighth grade. When I was a kid, our school was overcrowded, so they would split us up between the seventh grade would go from 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock lunchtime, and then the eighth graders would go from 12 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So I got to stay up late at night. And I would watch some of these talk shows like Alan Burke and Joe Pine, and they would bring people on to talk about the Kennedy assassination. So actually, it was eighth grade is when I really got into it. And then I read 6 Seconds in Dallas by Tink Thompson. I read Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. And then when I was in college, I did an independent study project on the assassination. I published a couple of articles in the college newspaper, and I actually wrote a screenplay. And this is 1975, and my professor tells me you can't use the name Kennedy because everybody knows what happened to Kennedy. You have to create a fictional president because there'd be no interest in the screenplay. Bad advice. And then I kind of took off. I started, focusing on trying to get a career. So I didn't, if I had, I regret that I did not try to get a job with the House Select Assassinations Committee or even the Assassination Records Review Board when I was a lawyer, that the review board was in existence. But I was so busy with my environmental law career, I just didn't think about taking a break. And then uh, in 2016, I had kidney cancer, but I was very lucky. I caught it early. And so they just had to remove the kidney. And I said to myself, okay, what am I going to do with this bonus time? So I decided to engage in my Kennedy research, and I got active with this organization, Kappa, Citizens Against Political Assassinations. We put on a mock trial, a 2-day mock trial at the South Texas College of Law in November 2017. And then, of course, we did a bunch of programming. We did a mock court of inquiry proceeding in 2018. And and then when President Trump postponed the release of the records, during his first term, I sent a FOIA request to Freedom of Information Act request to the, which I guess is open records in UK, to get copies of the underlying correspondence to understand why he postponed the records because he had said he was going to release them. And they didn't give them to me at first. I had to sue them. Then I got thousands of documents, and then I saw that, basically the National Security Council and the CIA had hijacked the process, and they had told the president at the last minute, Mr. President, it's too soon to release the records, which 60 years is too soon, right? Um, and when President Biden came into office, since he had been one of the senators that signed the JFK Records Act, which required the disclosure of the records, we figured he would, you know, uh, release the rest of the records. And then when he didn't, I tried to get, I organized a group of people, open records, open good government types, lawyers, historians, researchers, to sign a letter, sending it to the president, asking him to release the records. That was ignored. I went to Congress. I asked my representative, who was head of the Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives, which has continuing jurisdiction over the JFK Records Act, asked her to maybe hold a hearing to see why the executive branch wasn't complying, but they were Democrats. Biden was a Democrat, so they weren't going to embarrass the president. So then um, myself and another lawyer, Bill Simpich, we convinced Mary Farrell Foundation to file a lawsuit against President Biden and the National Archives for failure to comply with the JFK Records Act. Now, that case is still going on. Um, and of course, in January, President Trump issued a new executive order certifying that the time had come to release all the records. But the problem is that all the records are not in the JFK collection that's maintained by the National Archives. There are records outstanding that have not been transmitted to the collection. And so we're trying to get those outstanding records that the Records Review Board had asked for. They went out of business in 1998. And they went out of business not because the job was done, it was because Congress decided they weren't going to pay for them anymore. And so there are outstanding records that are within the possession of the federal government, but not at the National Archives. And so we want to get both all the records in the National Archives to be released, but then get these other records searched, obtained, put into the archives, and then released. So, and we have a congressional task force right now that's headed by Representative Paula Luna, Anna Paulina Luna, who she is a real fireball, and she's a great ally. Um, and she's working hard from the congressional side to try to get the records released. So that's sort of a thumb uh, nail of what my background is on this.
Larry, I meant to say, if you see me looking over, I'm not ignoring you. I'm putting stuff up on the screen so people at home can see what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yes, and I think you pointed out quite rightly there that it's not just that there's probably a lot of records that aren't in the official collection. It's it's also that there must be just an awful lot of other information, full stop. That I mean, there's probably personal testimonies that haven't been recorded, and observations on that day that were possibly ignored at the time. And then, of course, someone knows the truth. That's not in the record, is it? You know, the from my understanding, it was a very complex operation. There's talk of LBJ. There's talk of Jewish mafia. There's talk of Italian mob. Obviously, the patsy himself. So, have you at any time, Larry, like lost sort of faith or lost interest or thought that this is never going to happen?
Um, I have a couple of quixotic pursuits that I follow, and I never let myself get discouraged by setbacks. So I just say, this is what I want to do, and you know, my tombstone's going to say he was the man of La Mancha. Um, so um, it can be frustrating at times, but I just try to put my head to the nose, to the grindstone and keep moving forward. So we're at an interesting point right now because we have the president declaring that the record should be released. We have the leadership at the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, Department of Justice are all loyalists to the president and want to carry out his his wishes. And we have a Congress that's has a committee, a task force that's looking into this. So we have a unique time. This is probably as good a time since the 1970s. Now, obviously, the problem is that a lot of people have died, records have been destroyed, and memories fade. So we're never going to get, there's not going to be a smoking gun, for example, saying, here's how we're going to kill the president. The very reason that the CIA keeps seemingly innocuous documents classified, they have this what they call the mosaic theory, that a seemingly innocent document could give some hint to our adversaries about some, you know, process or information that would help put together this mosaic. Well, by the same token, all these little documents we're getting are helping us put together a mosaic on what happened or what likely happened. So it's when the people that support the official conclusion say, "Oh, this is a nothing burger," they're 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 looking for like a smoking gun that doesn't exist. These guys, particularly people that were involved in the assassination plots to kill Castro, they didn't put anything in writing. They were too smart to do that. So there's going to be no plan that says, here's how we're going to kill the president. But you can put together things through inferences, and there are times when coincidences are not coincidences. So yeah, I mean, we're never gonna there's gonna be some holes that historians are going to have to interpret. And if a historian is, there's a real lot of professional pressure to not engage in so-called conspiracy theories. So a lot of the people that are writing, the professional historians who are working in universities and writing books, they don't want to be ostracized, so they don't kind of go down this road, unfortunately. So, there's a real reluctance to really address this issue because to the American people, I mean, a lot of people that are supporting the Warren Commission, I call them false patriots. Even Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote that thick book, Reclaiming History, I think it was around page 988, somewhere in his book, he said, what would it mean to America if there was a conspiracy within the government to kill the president? It would mean that we Americans are no different than the Europeans and that our institutions are no better than those of a third world country. This is about defending America's honor. See, in the rest of the world, there are conspiracies, but not in America. It can't happen in America because we're special, we're exempt, we have American exceptionalism. So a lot of people are are defending the official position on because they think they're in some way defending America. When in fact, I think the value of the health of a democracy really is shown when you can find stuff about your country that is bad. You can let your people know about it and you can move forward from that. So there's a lot of misguided people out there. And then there's people that approach this through an ideological lens. A lot of it was weird. And for the longest time, it was the conservatives who were defending the CIA, poo-pooing any uh, thoughts about CIA involvement, and it was always the liberals who were believing in a conspiracy. And now it's flip-flopped. And now it's the conservatives who are, uh, looking into the deep state, and it's the Democrats who are defending the CIA. And if any of your viewers or listeners had seen the hearings that occurred in May, the congressional hearings, you would have seen that it was the Democrats were not serious about the investigation. They were using their time instead of to ask legitimate questions to the witnesses. They were using those times to somehow make political points against President Trump. They had no interest in the topic. So it's a really fascinating flip of what historically the attitudes were on, you know, on the assassination. And even the conservative people in the old days that believed there was a conspiracy really hoped they could somehow pin this on the Kremlin. And the liberals were hoping, were trying to rescue Oswald from the notion of him because they thought he was a communist. And they were trying to rescue him from this event because they thought he was a communist. So it's been a very interesting journey.
Yes, I bet. I think it's worth noting here for people that might not know it was Bush Senior that came up with the term conspiracy theorist specifically to shut people up talking about this incident. And he was, not only is there a photograph, I mean, it's allegedly a photograph of him in Dallas on that day, but also he was working for the CIA at the time. Is that correct?
Uh, it looks like he may have. So there was a memo in 1967 that the CIA came out with, and they coined the term conspiracy theorist, and they were talking points to give to the press to refute the conspiracy uh, articles, and they also were saying that nobody would use would turn to Oswald to be to conspire with. There are questions about Bush Sr. I mean, he had an oil company, Zapata, interesting name, because that I think was the code name for the Bay of Pigs. Um, and he had some connections. He was director of CIA under the Ford administration. So there is some belief that he had CIA connections before then. And
Yes.
there is a memo um, that came up about someone writing a letter to a George Bush of the CIA, but the explanation was that was a clerk. That wasn't the George H.W. Bush. It was a different George Bush. So, um, you take that with a grain of salt. And
So,
by the way, when the President Bush Sr. is the one that signed the JFK Records Act into law. Um, and when he signed it into law, he basically he signed a statement, issued a statement saying that he was signing it because this was unanimously passed by Congress, but he believes it infringes on his constitutional prerogatives as president, as commander in chief. So he kind of tried to say, I'm signing this, but it's not what you think it is.
so Larry, what is it about the Warren Commission that raised suspicion for you? And what 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 then is your take on what more likely happened?
So my critique of the Warren Commission has evolved over time as I matured and became a lawyer. So in the beginning, you know, I think my critiques were based on what I was reading, like from Tink Thompson and Mark Lane and others about the the medical evidence and the timing and the single bullet theory, um, and then the witnesses that were not interviewed, and then the accounts of people saying um, that their testimony was changed. And then as it became a lawyer and became involved in investigations and stuff, I could see the weaknesses of how the investigation was conducted. I mean, it was a deliberate exercise. It wasn't like it was incompetence, but the way they distorted facts, they exaggerated facts, they misstated facts, the way they ignored certain witnesses, the way they conducted interviews and made sure that they um, would pursue a certain line of questions and not ask other questions, or they would ignore answers and depositions that were inconvenient. And then, of course, uh, you have Alan Dulles, the former CIA director, and soon to be President Ford, taking the deposition of John McCone, who was then the current CIA director, and his assistant Helms, asking them about things that happened on the watch when Dulles was the CIA director. It's like he was the wrong person to be asking those questions. They're asking him questions about what the CIA knew about Oswald when he was in Russia. Well, that happened when Dulles was a CIA director. So he's asking McCone questions about the answers that only he knew. And everything was fixed like that. Every black witness that went before the Warren Commission, the first question they were asked was, "Have you ever had any problems with law enforcement before?" Which in 1964, that was a loaded question in the Deep South. So the more I looked into how the Warren Commission conducted its business once I became a lawyer. So first I was suspicious about some of the conclusions. And then as I became a lawyer and, learned how investigations are conducted, I became even more uh, dissatisfied with the effort. I mean, they clearly, this was political truth. This was designed to, as much to assuage the concerns of our allies as it was for domestic consumption. Because in Europe immediately assumed that Kennedy was killed by a right-wing conspiracy. And you can see there's lots of cables coming from the State Department, to Washington, revealing what's going on in Europe, in the UK and France and in Italy. And of course the CIA was saying, well, this is the Russians trying to undermine America by fomenting disbelief in, what's going on in America. But the Warren Commission wasn't much about trying to tell our allies, look, we're not a banana republic. This was a lone gunman. There was no right-wing conspiracy to kill the president, and our policies are going to stay the same. So the Warren Commission had multiple purposes.
I got
And then
you.
the House Select Assassinations Committee got hijacked. The first two people that were running it, Richard Sprague and Bob Tannenbaum, were going to do a real serious investigation. And they ended up having to resign, or the committee would have been disbanded. Um, so I think Congress never thought these guys were actually going to conduct a real investigation. And when they started doing it, the CIA circled the wagons. And then with both the Warren Commission, the House Select Assassinations Committee, and the Assassination Records Review Board, the bureaucrats knew they could wait out, they could run out the clock. They could just wait and delay and stall. And because these bodies all were time limited. And so they knew if they just kept delaying and delaying and stalling, at some point these guys were going to go away and they could keep their secrets.
So, even with the release of these so called documents, from my understanding, it doesn't lead anywhere. I've I've seen much more credible documentaries on YouTube explaining everything that happened that day. Um, and I guess the other thing we have to factor in is if there was there was obviously a conspiracy to kill the president. That's, he didn't shoot himself. And then clearly with the farcical findings of the Warren Commission, if we can call them that, people on the inside were perverting the course of justice for whatever reason. I think human weakness is probably they were getting blackmailed or profited some way, or they'd been filmed doing something that they probably shouldn't have been doing, and so I guess what I'm saying is I don't really hold out much hope, Larry, that anyone has any intention of letting the public know the truth. So that just leaves people like yourself to pull together everything, which you have done. I'm going to show your archive here, which is extensive here, folks. I'll put a link below so you can go and check this out. I was listening to some of this earlier. So I guess I just want to talk a bit more grassroots for people at home that want to hear about things going bang. So the Warren Commission came up with a magic bullet theory. What do we think of that?
They had to come up with the single bullet theory, which is also known as the magic bullet theory, because there were supposedly three shots, and it wasn't enough time to fire three individual shots. And first they tried to argue that one bullet hit the president and one bullet hit John Connolly and one missed, but then they had another bullet they discovered that hit this bystander, and now they had a problem. So it doesn't work for a number of reasons. And there is a Department of Justice attorney who, full disclosure, I am working with him. He created the most accurate 3D recreation of Dealey Plaza using drones, photogrammetry, scanning in all the photographs, taking into account the car, the height of everything, the height of the seats, everything. And he has run he's used this animation to do a trajectory analysis from the school book depository building using both ends of the time period when it was possible that if a shot went through both men, these are the end posts of when it was possible. And what that trajectory shows is that if a bullet had in fact gone through both men, uh, it would have emerged from Connolly's belly button and probably circumcised him. So because of the angle. Um, the all the studies that were done, they have distorted the position of the bodies. They distorted the relative size of the bodies, their position in air. Um, but the single bullet theory is necessary because there was not enough time to fire three separate shots in 6.5 seconds. So it's a bolt action rifle. And even when the Warren Commission tried to study the single bullet theory, all they did was test to see if a bullet can go through two men. They did not try to recreate the conditions on whether this was possible in terms of timing. And David Bellin, who was an attorney on the Warren Commission, testified to this fact in 1975 when he appeared before basically a hearing that was largely lost to history. Bella Abzug, who was a congresswoman from New York, um, held a hearing on the Warren Commission findings, and David Bellin testified. As it turns out, the Warren Commission actually had no authority to classify its records, and David Bellin even admitted that none of them had classification clearance, so they couldn't be even looking at classified documents, and so much less being able to classify their own documents. So the single bullet theory is necessary to support the lone gunman, because without the single bullet theory, without the one bullet going through both men, causing all the wounds, then you have to have a second gunman from the rear. And then, of course, the next question is, was Kennedy hit in the front of the head because of the way his head went back? And, you know, there have been supporters of the Warren Commission that come up with the jet effect and some other junk science to try to argue that's really either a neuromuscular reaction or a physics reaction. Um, so there's two problems with the conclusion. One is there is potentially a shot from the front, and it would appear that the X-rays on the autopsy would support there being a frangible bullet that would have hit the front of the head and fractured into thousands of bits, which is why it would not have, hit Jackie Kennedy. And then the bullet going through both men, from the rear. And there actually was a guy, there's been 7 mock trials held by law schools and colleges since 1967. 6 of them have resulted in acquittals or hung juries. In fact, the one I was involved in 2017, we got a hung jury. And that was only giving us 2.5 hours to defend Oswald. The rest of the day was about the medical evidence and whether there was a shot from the front. Um, in the 1992 mock trial that was conducted by the American Bar Association, they had a company, Failure Analysis, and the CEO of that company did an experiment firing a frangible bullet into a large bucket of a plastic jug of water. And what he learned was that when the frangible bullet hits, all the energy is dissipated upon impact, and like none of the particles went through the plastic. None of the particles went through the other side of the plastic jug. So if Kennedy was hit by a frangible bullet, all the energy would have been dissipated upon the impact, which would have caused, the head to go back, and then all the fragments, you had the fragment trail on the front of the body, the front of the head, which is what the X-rays show.
Yeah, that's where it gets confusing. Larry, have you ever, or conflicting, I should say, have you ever seen the documentary Everything is a Rich Man's Trick?
I have not.
Oh, it's fascinating. So everything's a rich man's trick. It's this somewhat senior gentleman, let's say, who's just sat in his armchair narrating everything from, I don't know, like Bay of Pigs, JFK, up until I think 9/11. And
Okay.
I don't know where he gets his information from because he's not quoting his sources. It's just a document, he's talking to the camera. But in a nutshell, he posits that there was a meeting the night before, LBJ, Mafia, Cuban interests, all this kind of thing. That on the day there was anything up to, I think, 11 snipers. I might have that wrong. It might be six, but it's certainly a lot more than what we've been led to believe. That the umbrella man, the guy with the umbrella, was the signal guy. And the reason he puts the umbrella up, even though it's bright sunlight, is he signaled that the first shots have missed, or they've hit the president, but they haven't taken him out. He puts the umbrella up. That's the signal for the guy in the storm drain, which is underneath the underpass. And the guy's crawled half a mile up that storm drain. In fact, he went back to work covered in mess. And his employer, because of the suspiciousness of it all, called the police, who came and arrested him and then released him without charge. But his signal was the umbrella going up, which is why he shot the president from the front. Now, as if this isn't sort of eye-opening enough and relatively plausible, it goes further, because there's a chap, I'm just going to show a photo of him, called J.D. Tippit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you probably know more about him than me, but in this documentary, Larry, they put forward that because they needed to show a shot from the back to support the book depository Lee Harvey Oswald scenario, they shot an innocent policeman in Dallas whose name was J.D. Tippit, this chap here, folks, and his nickname was JFK because he had this uncanny likeness to JFK, and indeed he's not quite the spitting image, but he's certainly a handsome guy that could be taken for him. And what they did is they brought in one of the, I'm guessing, a sort of mafia associate who was a top surgeon. They performed the necessary plastic surgery on J.D. Tippit to support the theory of of Oswald, basically. And don't ask me, I can't remember how J.D. Tippit was shot, but I think he was the officer that they then blamed on Oswald from after the cinema, right? But it wasn't Oswald. It was the whoever this dark network were. And what they then had to do was swap the cadavers over while the coffin was on Air Force One, which is why they called Jackie Kennedy Ford for the swearing in of LBJ. And here's the thing. The swearing in ceremony was made up, obviously, because he's already president. The president's dead. He's vice president, so he's automatically president. There's no sort of swearing in. But what they needed to do was get Jackie Kennedy away from the coffin because she wouldn't leave her late husband's side, to swap these cadavers over. And I know that probably sounds utterly bizarre to people out there, but I think it's certainly the way that this documentary puts it across makes it seem a lot more plausible than the magic bullet theory.
Well, I'm familiar with those theories, and in fact, the the body switch. So there's an interested Doug Horn, who I really respect. He was one of these guys. He was one of the people that worked on on the House Select Assassination Committee did excellent work. He's I mean, I love him to, to the dear end. I mean, and he's a strong advocate of like the three casket um scenario that three caskets were delivered to Bethesda Naval Hospital that night. And he just dropped a new video this week where he discovered photographs showing both a black um, and a gray ambulance, two separate ones. Of course, the timing for the black one is you don't know exactly when it was, and the gray one you can pretty much you can see people putting the coffin into carrying it into the Bethesda. But what I will say is on the coffin situation, yes, Jackie Kennedy went to the front of the plane for the ceremonial swearing in of the president, but there is testimony like by Kevin O'Donnell, who was the president's aide and was the one sitting in the car, the backup car, that he didn't go up front and he never took his eyes off the coffin. So, I've tried to find an opportunity where this could happen, and I can't. It requires someone to be lying about their their ability to that they were, with the coffin. And so, but I'm familiar with those theories, and familiar with, there is testimony. They supposedly the House Select Assassinations Committee found the guy with the umbrella, and he claimed he was doing a Chamberlain thing, that he was using the umbrella as a subtle dig at Kennedy using, Chamberlain had that umbrella, and he was trying to say that, Kennedy um, was an appeaser. Um, so it's people have theories, and then some they're interesting. I have to follow the evidence, and I try to follow the evidence, and I try to evaluate the evidence, and um, I do think there was a conspiracy. I think there were two shooters in the back, possibly one in the front. Whether there were eight shots fired or 11, I don't know. I will never be able to determine that. A lot of evidence was destroyed, and they cleaned out the limo, while the president's body was inside of Parkland Hospital, they were washing out some of the blood and stuff, and so we have a tampered crime scene, and then of course the autopsy wasn't done properly. So there's lots of questions that are never going to be answered, unfortunately. And you have to kind of say, and a lot of people will come up with this phrase, Occam's razor, to try to say the simplest explanation is the one that makes the most sense. But that's not what Occam's razor says. Occam's razor stands for the proposition that among equally plausible arguments, the simplest one is usually the correct one. It's not just the simplest one is usually the correct one. They have to have equally plausible. And that's where a lot of the lone gunman supporters, come up with. Look, when we did the mock trial, there's more evidence of Oswald being elsewhere at 12:30 than on the sixth floor of the school book depository. Um, Jesse Curry, who was the one of the policemen, one of the not the sheriff, but he was I think maybe police chief. He later said, "This is the Dallas police office chief, Jesse Curry, said that nobody could put a gun in Oswald's hand at 12:30 on the sixth floor." So first of all, you have real difficulties about whether Oswald actually was a shooter or not. I personally don't think that he was a shooter. Now, he may have been involved in a plot that was different than what actually happened. I think he might have thought that there was going to be a demonstration, and that his job, he was like, I think that his job was to look like a pro Castro sympathizer in order to flush out the Castro agents that are infiltrating the Cuban exile groups. When he was handing out flyers in New Orleans, I think that was an attempt first to make him look like a communist for the plotters, but I think he thought that he was helping to find who was the because Castro always seemed to know when there was going to be a raid. And so, they were finding out about these raids before they were launched. And so the Cuban exile groups were infiltrated with Castro agents. And so I think that was his job. His job was to find out who these people were. And so he's posing as a pro-Castro supporter. Perhaps on the day of the assassination, he thought there was going to be some demonstration. And then when he realized the president was shot, he went, oh, you know, oh crap. And then he went to his assigned rendezvous point, which was the theater, and then that's where they captured him. And I think Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans Mafia chief, who was actually on trial that week for defrauding the government with his Guatemala birth certificate, and had he been found guilty, they would have deported him. I think he probably paid for the operation. Now he also his territory included Texas, and he gave LBJ 50 grand a year. He paid off 50 grand a year to LBJ. So he had his tentacles and everything. And Jim Garrison didn't go after him because Jim Garrison, I think, was compromised by Carlos Marcello. And Hoover, um, the chief law enforcement executive, or at least the head of the FBI, um, he had a problem with the ponies. He liked to bet on racing horses, and he was getting tips from Frank Costello, the head of the mafia in New York, on fixed races. So they knew that they had him by the short hairs. He wasn't going to let the investigation go towards the mafia. So I think the guys that helped organize the assassination attempts against Castro in the Miami CIA office probably planned it. I think Marcelo probably paid for it, and then they used the exiles or the shooters that were being trained to kill Castro probably were used to kill Kennedy. So it's a complex uh, conspiracy because the mafia could not control the autopsy. There had to be somebody else to be able to control the autopsy to make sure that it went in a certain direction. And, simplest question is you have people that are government workers who are basically told that they have to keep their mouths shut or they're going to lose their pension and potentially go to court martial. That usually is enough to keep people on the straight and narrow. And I believe that Humes, who was the autopsy doctor, and Boswell, I believe they were promoted almost immediately. And then Humes retired the next year. He retired at a much higher salary. So people get paid off.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and then LBJ, I don't know whether LBJ had foreknowledge. Uh, you know, I would want to see a little more evidence before I would publicly accuse a former president of conspiring to kill a president. Just because that's the way I am. I mean, I think I can make a case out right now that Marcello Traficante and Jimmy Hoffa conspired to try to kill the president. It doesn't mean that they're the ones that did. I'm just saying that I could make a case out. I could go into court and make a case out that they engaged in a conspiracy to commit, this unlawful act. I don't have enough evidence yet to say LBJ did that. I mean, to me, if I'm LBJ and I want to get rid of Kennedy, I would have my buddy Hoover release all the dirt that Hoover had on the Kennedys in 1964. That would be my choice of trying to damage John Kennedy because Hoover had all the dirt on Kennedy's affairs and everything else. And so that would have been my route if and LBJ was a pretty shrewd guy. I wouldn't have to resort to arranging for a murder and then potentially being subject to a firing squad. But, you know, but he clearly was involved in the cover up for sure. Um, I just don't have enough information yet to say that he had foreknowledge. Well, there's foreknowledge, and then there's actual participation. It's hard for me to think that a vice president would actually engage in a conspiracy to plan to kill the sitting president. Now, he might have foreknowledge. That's possible that he may knew that something was coming and chose not to say anything. But so there's different levels when people say, "Oh, the mafia did it" or LBJ did it. What does that mean, right? It's like they didn't actually pull the triggers. So what role did they play? And it could have been a financial role. It could have been a planning role. Um, so, but clearly, American policy changed from that moment on. The country went in a separate direction, and and lessons were learned since from that. I mean, we had the Gulf of Tonkin after that to get us into Vietnam, and then they learned they could lie and get away with it. And we had the Iran Contra, um, Watergate. Watergate involved some of the same Cubans that were involved with the Bay of Pigs. And it's interesting when the Assassination Records Review Board asked for the Secret Service for records on their threat assessments against the president in the fall of '63, they destroyed the records and nobody got punished. Lo and behold, when January 6th happens and the Secret Service is asked for their emails, they're destroyed and no one gets punished. And as long as people can continue to misbehave and not get punished for breaking the law, this is going to continue. And I could also point to stuff that the Democrats have done as well. I'm not just blaming one side here, but you know I when I tell young people that this is not purely a historic event. I mean, when I was the Kennedy assassination to kids in high school now was the equivalent of World War I to when I was in high school. So it's a historic event to them, but it's still affecting American politics. And because there are policy decisions that were made, and also that people learned they could lie and get away with it. And the weird thing is, when you know people in power, you hear little stories, there's whispers, and they will say things like, for example, there's this. I'm a co-host of JFK Facts with Jeff Morley. And last week we had this guy on as a Frenchman, Bernard Lefau, Legault. I forget his name. It's his last name, but his family had like one of the first banks in France, and he he mingled with with De Gaulle and other people, and he wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination. And when he was writing it, he had five French publishers chasing him for the book. And then when he's finished, suddenly nobody wants to publish it. And he asked one of the publishers, why is that? This is last year, right? And he's told by his friend at the publisher, we got instructions from high up not to publish a book that says that the president of the United States was killed by his own government because that would help Putin. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that's going on. And then he said that when I forget which of the French premiers it wasn't Mitterrand, but somebody was meeting with Jerry Ford, and they asked Jerry Ford, who had been on the Warren Commission, and this is now when Jerry Ford is president, what happened? And Jerry Ford told him there was a conspiracy, but we couldn't prove it. And this person, this Bernard, is friends with a person who overheard that conversation. So there's these whispers, like in officialdom, they'll whisper to each other what they know, but they won't tell the whole world what they know. Because as Jack Nicholson said in the movie A Few Brave Men, we can't take the truth.
Yes. So Larry, um, let's just take the Israel angle then. I was just highlighting your. Um, it was John Hamer, wasn't it, that you mentioned? Was that
Uh,
the name of the chap that you said was a good friend of yours? I thought you said John Hamer.
there's a Jeff Morley who's my co-host on JFK Facts.
Ah, right. Okay, I might have got that wrong. I I, I just came across a book though by John Hamer saying bum, bum, no doubt the assassination. I'll just show our friends at home. No doubt the assassination was a result of an extensive, highly organised and coordinated joint campaign of necessity involving almost every element of the American establishment and to a lesser extent Israel, directed by the forces of the British Crown. Does that bear any merit?
Um, I am very dubious that. So when you look back at history, you look at an event and it happened. So it seems like it's a certainty that it would happen, right? But in fact, a lot of things could have gone wrong and it could not have happened. I can't imagine that Israel in 1963 would plot to kill the leader of its most important and sometimes only ally. That doesn't make any sense to me. Um, Now, did James Angleton, our counterintelligence person at the CIA, have close relations with Mossad? Yes, yes, absolutely. Um, did he use Mossad for some things? Yes, but I just that kind of claim to me require that's an extraordinary claim to me, and I think that requires extraordinary evidence. So, if someone presents me with some evidence, I'll consider it. But I that doesn't I don't see Israel plotting to kill President Kennedy. I know there's the argument that he didn't want Israel to have nuclear weapons, but Israel has the strongest lobby in this country. So I can't imagine they would resort to murdering a president. They're a most important ally. So that's just my gut reaction. Again, but show me some evidence and I might change my mind. But we ever so often we get somebody that comes on JFK Facts podcast and tries to argue about Israel, and we let them talk. But I haven't heard anything yet that's persuasive. I don't know anything about Britain. I know that when Philby got taken down, that definitely shattered Angleton because Philby and Angleton were very close, and that you know, Angleton shared everything with Philby. So he was a shattered man at that point. Did he get, I don't know what effect it had on his, I presume it had affected his ability to carry out his duties. Um, I don't know whether, I know that the guys in the CIA, that the leadership of the CIA felt that they had as much a right to to shape the foreign policy of the United States as the constitutionally elected president. In fact, one of the records that came out that was really interesting, that's gotten some attention but not enough, is after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy asked Arthur Schlesinger to come up with proposals to reform the CIA. And for 60 years, there were 2 pages that were completely blacked out. And they finally got unredacted in March. And what it turns out was that Arthur Schlesinger was telling President Kennedy that 48% of the staff of our embassies across the world were actually CIA employees. Now, we've always used to make fun of the Kremlin, the Russians, that their embassies were basically, nests of KGB agents. But that was the same case for us. 48%, that the entire top floor of our embassy in Paris was all CIA. And that Schlesinger said the CIA was a state within a state. And they oftentimes had better relations with our foreign governments, our allies, than the State Department did. So this was what they were trying to hide all these years that, Kennedy was trying to fix. It even came out that somebody bugged the office of the CIA director. It's like, I don't know if this happens in the UK. So, here, this is like all news to us. I mean, you know, um,
Mm, mm.
there definitely was a power struggle going on about the direction of foreign policy in the United States in the early 1960s. John Kennedy was definitely trying to take us down a road that was different from the traditional Cold War approach, and there was lots of resistance. There was a a Secret Service agent who was the person that tried to intimidate and did intimidate Dr. Perry into changing his view that the throat wound was an entry wound into an exit wound. And he was talking, he was trying to recruit somebody years later, a college kid, to be an undercover agent. And they were talking about the Kennedy assassination. And he said that uh, the old man, Joe Kennedy, was an appeaser and John Kennedy was a traitor. So that's the way they thought of him because he was trying to, and do you know the story about the back channel to with Castro?
No.
So I know we're going over time. Sorry. I'll finish with this story.
Yeah.
So Lisa Howard, who is the first primetime newswoman, and she really, I don't know why she hasn't gotten as much. She should really be acclaimed for her role as a woman reporter, but she wasn't. But anyway, she interviewed Castro in May of 1963, and Castro tells her offline that he would like to explore normalizing relations with the U.S. He was pissed about the way the missile crisis ended, and he was disgruntled with the Russians, and he just was thinking of, he was thinking maybe there's a way to reconcile. And she goes and tells the Kennedy administration they're not interested initially. And then in September of 63, she has a party at her house, and she has Bill Atwood, who's one of our envoys to the UN. She puts him in a room, her bedroom, with this guy Luega from Cuba, who's Castro's right-hand person. And they're talking about, is there a way to kind of, for our countries to kind of explore this. And Atwood then reports back to the president, and he but the CIA is against this. And I'm convinced that they told the exiles about this. Anyway, a French reporter is going to be interviewing Castro in November 63. And so Atwood arranges to have him speak to President Kennedy. And so President Kennedy meets him in the Oval Office and he gives a message to Castro. Basically, he acknowledges all the bad things that the United States has done to Cuba and that, if Castro's willing to give up communism, there could be a path forward. Jean Daniel is meeting with Castro the day of the assassination. They're having lunch. And Castro gets the call. The president's been shot. How bad? Don't know. Hangs up. 20 minutes later, president's dead. Castro turns to Jean Daniel and says, your peace mission has just ended. And Jean Daniel wrote about this. There's a book that Peter Gornbluth has written that documents this. This is a documented fact. But Kennedy was taking this country in a different direction. And I think There were forces within his country did not want to go in that direction. And on top of that, Bobby Kennedy was cracking down on the mafia. The old man had cut a deal with the mafia and to try to get him elected. And Carlos Marcello had been deported to Guatemala the first couple months of the of the administration, and he was in a trial. He actually bribed a juror, and so he was found not guilty an hour before President Kennedy, no, an hour after President Kennedy was killed, but he didn't learn about President Kennedy being killed until right after the verdict. But he clearly had motives as well. So plenty of people had motives, um, and we're trying to get some more of the pieces of the puzzle put together.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the Israel thing because our people listening will get cross with me if I don't flag it up. But I think when JFK gave that speech and he talked about a dark monolithic conspiracy that operates by covert means that's, essentially infiltrated the fabric of a very honest country, America. I think he was talking about the dark business interests that used Israel as their front company with which
Mm.
to hide behind to, I don't know, conduct their new world order as it's referred to. I think his assassination itself has just got Mossad written all over it, although, they're not the only people that conduct the art of war. Or what is it they call it? War by deception or something.
Well, are you saying that, so are people thinking that Mossad was used to take the president down, or that this was like a policy? It's one thing to say that we're going to use Mossad agents to try to pull off our own policy, right? As opposed to this being a policy of Israel.
Yeah, I think it's the easier way to look at it is to look at the other end to see how things have panned out because nobody took the president's word seriously. Subsequently, we had, I don't want to say that the number, we had a certain set of events in New York and Washington 20 years ago, which made the world sit up and realize, unfortunately, half the world's asleep, so they don't look further than the CNN broadcast.
Hmm. Hmm.
In London, we had not on such a magnitude, but we had similar horrific atrocities. We've now got the absolute, for want of a better word, the devastation of our youth, who now are born, they're born male, but they're told in school, oh, you can just choose to be a female, and we'll pay to start cutting your bits off, which personally I just think is satanic.
Mm.
I mean, it
Mm.
took me 50, I'm 55 now. I'm still not responsible enough to make decisions about my body or my sexuality. Give me another 50 years, I might be about there. To think that they're taking 6-year-olds and 10-year-olds, at their word, and I think it's all by design, Larry. I honestly do. I think people now are so far away from God and spirit. They're so much sold on materialism. They're so desperately lost and seeking some kind of answers, but they've only ever been taught the material root of things. So more tattoos, more Instagram accounts, more social media. Oh, if I have 3 Ferraris, maybe the girls will like me. And any of us of any age know none of that stuff makes you happy. What makes you happy is having a connection with whatever you call this big experiment, whether that's God, nature, spirit. And I really do think that JFK saw these dark forces in play. He saw that they network incredibly. He saw that they probably operate through, how can we say, esoteric method going back perhaps to ancient Egypt, Babylon, using numbers and symbols instead of the word of mouth that we all believe is the only way to communicate. And yeah, I think he, amongst all the other stuff he was making himself unpopular about. um,
Well,
I
there's
think
no doubt that we humans are built to worship something, right? And I mean, the pastor of my church, I mean, my father was Jewish, but my mother was Italian. I ended up going to uh, a a a Protestant church, and Tim Keller was our minister, who's a famous pastor, very intellectual, and he said that we are built to worship, and whether it's materialism or something else, we will, we will pursue that thing that we worship to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. And in today's world, it's just there's so many distractions. I when we were talking about Mickey Mantle before, I was joking with you that, I didn't know that, you know, when I was a kid, we had people that we had these fictions about our heroes, that they were very close to perfect beings. And those were used to help us stay in line, to be disciplined and to work hard. And, and if you do this, you'll end up like that person. I mean, that whole thing was a fiction, but it kept us on the straight and narrow. And now there's just so much out there. It's really hard. I feel bad for young males because
absolutely.
they're getting really bad signals. And you're right. I mean, uh, it's one thing for the parents to try to do the surgery when the kid's below 10, but letting a teenager decide, oh, I'm unhappy and therefore I'm going to change my sex. We're all unhappy when we're teenagers,
Yeah.
you know, but I don't, we're going way off the original topic here. But no, it's a difficult time now, and what's remarkable is how it's happening all over the world.
My hero always will be Tarzan,
Tarzan.
because he lived in the nature, he stood up against evil, and most importantly, he looked after his boy. And that's just my mantra for life. But
Hmm.
my, my boy, he rather just scroll through YouTube than, than watch Tarzan. He's just not interested, and you can see that this change in the sort of traditional role models. But Larry, I didn't want to finish on a sort of down note. I got a couple more interesting questions.
Okay.
Just looking at my notes here. So, what is the one piece of evidence that you've uncovered through your research that wasn't in the scheme of things before?
Well, um, we've we've learned that the CIA did an investigation the weekend of the assassination through March of '64 that they had previously denied they had done. This guy, Donald Heath, had gone down to Miami and he was tasked with investigating whether the Cuban exiles or or Castro supporters were behind the assassination. They denied that they ever did this. Um, their reports were generated, and we haven't seen those reports. So we now know of this existence of this investigation, and we're we're trying to get those reports um, found if they still exist. And that's important because that shows that the government, even after Hoover announced that Oswald was the shooter, the CIA was still looking for the killers. So that's important. Um, I think that the 3D animation that we did, that we actually, John Orr, that we paid to to create this 3D animation, that is using modern technology to try to answer the questions. And that I think demolishes the single bullet theory. Um, John Orr also discovered that there was organic material at the on the nose of the bullet fragment that was found in the limo. They had always thought that was inorganic, and it turned out it's human tissue. And we want to try to get the FBI or someone to do DNA testing on that because that could also help answer or refute the single bullet theory. Because if the tissue is that of John Connolly, then clearly he wasn't just injured by one bullet because those are bullet fragments in the front of the car. And if it's John Kennedy's DNA, is it scalp tissue or throat tissue? Because if it's scalp tissue, then that also demolishes the single bullet theory. So those are two, and I'm trying to think of anything. That's probably the more important stuff that we're finding. There's other stuff that's not as sexy, um, but it helps fill in some of the gaps that we've been. I mean, as a lawyer, I'm looking for evidence, and we find some more bits of information. I think I have a bit much better understanding now of the role of Carlos Marcello um, with the assassination, the way he may have funded it. Um, but I'm not quite ready to write a book about it. But I think I have a pretty good feel now about how that worked.
So, Larry, last question then. If there was anybody from this era who was involved, alive or dead, that you could speak to, who would it be and what question would you ask them if you could only ask one question?
Well, I think the obvious question would be I would love to talk to Lee Oswald because he never got a chance to speak publicly about his role. Um, that would be fascinating to be able to sit down with him and ask him the kinds of questions he was never asked by Dallas police, by reporters. He did say he was a patsy, but I'd like to go through, the last 6 months of his life and go past the denials and find out what was really going on in his life because he's a strange guy for a 23-year-old person. The things that he did, the people he came across,
Mm.
just it doesn't seem it. The odds of him coming across all those people and being just a normal, everyday high school dropout just doesn't make sense. How did he know to go to Helsinki to get into the Soviet Union? Who told him that? Where did he learn that? I mean, that was the back door into Russia. You know, I mean, so I yeah, so he would be the person in terms of trying to solve the assassination that I would want to talk to. Who would you want to talk to?
Um, Good question. We should swap places, Larry.
No, I'm curious because I mean
Uh,
that to me was like the most obvious person.
yeah,
Maybe
no,
maybe
no.
Jack Ruby.
It,
Maybe Jack Ruby is the other guy.
well, we say Jack Ruby, and we mentioned Israel. We should mention his real name, which was Jack Rubenstein, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes.
So again, there's all possibly tenuous, but when
And
someone
he allegedly, according to Burke Griffin, who was a staff lawyer for the Warren Commission, his belief is that Jack Ruby the day of the assassination, there was this um, Dallas Morning News had, wanted for treason, and they had the black frame and John Kennedy. Well, that was apparently paid for by an organization that was headed by a Jewish person. And uh, um, Burt Griffin says that Ruby was afraid the Jews were going to be blamed for the assassination, and so he was trying to avenge the Jewish people, and that was his motive for killing Kennedy, killing Oswald.
Got you. Got you. So who would I want to speak to? Oh, I'm going to say off the top of my head, if indeed this did happen, it would be the chap in the storm drain.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. He wouldn't be able to tell me who was behind it, but he would be able
Right,
to.
right, because they're never told. Right,
Yeah.
everyone is very, compartmentalized.
Yeah. Um, Either that or I know I shouldn't, I don't get two goes at this, but if I had a second go, it would be the president. And I'd say, Mr. President, who do you think's out to get you? and, and
Well, I'd love to talk to him just for any reason, right? Not just for the assassination.
yeah,
There are some people that I call them the Forrest Gumps of the JFK assassination, like James Files, Judith Baker. I think there's some people that they try to associate themselves with the assassination, for publicity.
Files is the ex-con, if that's the right terminology, that said that he was on the assassination team.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
they
yes.
actually. A I saw one of these lie detector people. These people that work in crime
Yeah.
and they can tell when someone's lying. And their verdict on him was, they said, he certainly believes that he's saying the truth.
Right, right. Well, con men, look, con men can beat lie detectors because they're good at lying,
Mm.
right? So lie detectors are good for people that are not used to lying or uncomfortable about lying, and then it creates uh, biofeedback. But if you're a person that is a con man, it's easy to lie. That's your whole life. Um, but there's nothing that he said, when I listened to him, that he couldn't have learned by reading books, you know, while he was in jail.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
and I think he's the kind of, there are certain people that want to sell their life story to get a movie made of them. There was a book, the movie that Robert Redford made, the last one he made about the guy, the old man and the gun. I think that's what they were trying to do. Um,
Mm.
it's amazing how people are willing to and put them that people are willing to put themselves into a crime in order to get celebrity.
Yeah, there's something I've noticed since I've been podcasting because I research an awful lot of stuff. I look at a lot of people that are topical, that are being guests on lots of shows, and I've come across this thinking, and somehow I think it links to childhood trauma, is that people can be so convincing, and it's something to do with a kind of narcissistic psychopathy where they can tell this story and look you right in the eye and not give any sign away. And maybe it's they genuinely believe it. As with this potentially with this Files guy, and I had one guy on from Hawaii. His name was Bob. Oh, what was his name? I can't remember. But anyway, he came on and he told this absolutely fascinating yarn, story at one point, and he said this with absolute sincerity. He said he was in a room with George Bush, and an alien grey, he referred to it, entered the room and walked through the wall. And he said it with absolutely deadpan. And then a couple of things. It left me thinking, Larry, I think this guy's been, and I'm not laughing at people that have different views. I think it's great that people challenge official narratives. But I
Yeah.
was wondering, has this boy been really damaged from childhood to the point where he's almost like MK Ultra programmed into he genuinely believes this so much that he can tell the story and it comes. And the funny thing was, a week later, after putting the podcast up, I had the Hawaii police contact me. Said, could I give them this guy's whereabouts or something? And I was sort of, well, I'm not, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. And they said, have you got his contact? And for some strange reason, I had actually lost his contact, so that was a no-brainer sort of thing. But
Yeah.
But then 2 weeks later, the platform, the one that we're on, I don't want to say their name, but the one that this video will be watched on probably now, they took our video down. And they didn't give me a strike. They didn't put me on a warning or anything. They just took it down. They didn't say this doesn't meet our standards as they usually do. It just disappeared. It's so
Wow.
Maybe some things in life, I don't know. We
Well, I read a great book called The Confidence Men, and it's about con men, and it was really mind opening for me as to there are people that have just incredible talents that, I mean, con men have been with us since the beginning of time. And there are some people that just have an enormous talent. It's unfortunate that they use this talent for a wrong thing, but they make you really feel like, even like when you're in the presence of some politicians, there are some politicians that when you're talking to them, they make you feel like you're the only person in the room. It's just this gift to, anyway. So, well, that was interesting that those two people that you mentioned. So, anyway, Congress is in recess. They're going to come back in September. And there's supposed to be some files coming from the Russians, about 5 feet high worth of files from the KGB, which no one has ever seen before. They're about Oswald's surveillance by the KGB. So there may be some really interesting news in September or no, October.
Wow, we shall all keep our fingers crossed.
Yes.
The name for our friends at home, it was Robert Wiegand was the chap that came on the podcast, and then mysteriously, off he went. You can still find that podcast on our audio, and I believe I put it on our locals channel. Larry, that just leads me to say, first off, I should just say I absolutely adore Americans. I've had such a great time in your wonderful country on several occasions. My first ever proper holiday was after I served in the Northern Ireland conflict. We treated ourselves to 10 days in New York, staying on Fifth Avenue where my friend's uncle had an apartment. He was the dean of the Fashion Institute of New York.
Oh, okay.
They had all Marilyn Monroe's dresses and stuff in there, on like in a freezer or something to protect them and this kind of thing. We had an absolutely brilliant time. Had dinner on Windows on the World on top of the World Trade Center twice. And every guest, every American I've had on my show has been an absolute delight, including yourself, Larry. So massive, massive thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I'll let you know if we have any interesting news in the fall.
Yeah, please do. And, there's open invitation. Come back on the show at any time. We're going to put your links below, Larry, so people can get hold of you and read through your research themselves. That just leaves me to say, Larry, stay on the line so when I push record off, I can say goodbye properly. But to everybody at home, thank you for supporting us on Locals, Patreon, or becoming a YouTube member. If you can like and subscribe, that would be absolutely absolutely brilliant. And we'll see you soon. Much love.